Hey everybody, back again with James Sehua. Did I get it? No, I think I did it too much.
A little bit too much, but you got it.
Yeah, this time for a dialogos rather than a jazz session. And today, what we'll be talking about is truth and the nature of truth, and I guess the various ways we might think about trying to seek it or approach it or define it. And I mean, I just watched recently, James, you put out like a little lecture masterclass type thing on truth, or a series of, I couldn't find if there was a whole one, but and some of that, especially in the first three short sort of 10 to 15 minute videos, would definitely recommend to anyone listening. But yeah, there was like really great introductory material in there. And I mean, lots to talk about as we kind of expand as the discussion moves forward today. But I guess to begin with, I mean, it's been nearly a year and a half, maybe a little over a year and a half since we first had our first conversations, you know what I mean? And obviously those revolved around, in a way, the nature of truth. I mean, more specifically metaphysics, right? And certain questions about existence. But that's kind of what you talk about in the masterclass is that, you know, metaphysics is central to that search for truth. And you talk about it reducing to unity. And I guess, could you just like open that up a bit more and kind of give your own introduction in your own words to I guess, how you
Sure.
think about truth?
Yeah, so I'll actually begin with the title because you I was just saying this to a friend before recording this. Like a friend of mine, she's a marketer and she's like, "Hey, you should call it a masterclass. Nobody wants to hear a lecture series, as the title, you should change it." So I actually had it as a lecture series before, but then I took her advice. I still think it sounds a little arrogant, so I'm just putting that out there. So I'm not a master at telling you what truth is all about. It just sounds so
Yeah.
pompous. But yeah. Anyway, so yeah, it's a lecture series and I hadn't planned anything. I just sort of loosely organized the structure of it, like per episode or per chunk. But I did actually also have some bullet points for each episode, if you will. That being said, I tried to give it a structure that could elucidate, at the very least, what the search for truth entails. So it's not necessarily a statement on truth, at least not the first half. The second half is my personal statement on what truth is, how it works, what it's all about. But yeah, the caveat or the disclaimer is so that people understand that I'm not making a definitive statement as to like, this is what the truth is. I'm doing it for myself. It's not to say that I think truth is relative necessarily either, but it's perhaps even not even relevant to say that truth is absolute or relative. It could be even more profound than that. And so that's the mini intro or the elucidation of that. And then, yeah, I think to answer to your 2 points, that metaphysics is required and that the search reduces to a unity. I'll start with this idea that metaphysics is required, in my estimation, because, or only under the condition that you're trying to articulate truth. If truth is something you wish to articulate and organize in your mind in some fashion, you require metaphysics. And then the second thing was that truth reduces to a unity. And I think that's just a way to get people a little bit beyond, or like just to save some time for most people, because the argument is very simple. There's nothing about the nature of reality that we cannot share. In other words, we all do have access to the same reality. And that is the one thing that I haven't heard anybody, number one, say that they are against that idea. And number two, if they were to, I really don't see how they could argue that we do not have access to the same reality. I mean, there is solipsism and subjectivity and all that kind of stuff, but we are all still relational to each other. I mean, there is a relationship between us. We can both have our, relative truths, but that exists within a higher existential framework that we both share, clearly, because there's you and there's me. So by extension, you're implying that there is a unity, even the two kind of realities that we're able to experience as to what is true or not true and to what degree. So I think that that's an important way to kind of just like get people to realize there is solid ground upon which we do agree somewhere. And it's that all truth reduces to a unity at base.
Yeah, I usually think of of that thing that everything reduces to as the transcendental ground. But I wanted to dig in a little bit more to this idea of unity, you know, because it's you know, I hadn't really had an occasion to think about it before, but it's actually a more enigmatic concept than I initially thought, you know, because I mean, obviously, you kind of explained there that this sense of like you and I have like our own individual perspectives are part of something greater than ourselves. We call it the universe, you know what I mean? And so like that, and you see that unity idea in the very name, right? Universe, right? Like
Yeah.
a unifying concept, unifying name. And so there's an idea there of like parts that all contribute towards some kind of whole, right? But I guess elsewhere, in that masterclass, as you kind of unpack the reduction to a unity idea, you talk a little bit about, first of all, the concept of a unit and the connection of that with, the concept of unity, right? Like like almost like a measuring, like a standardized measuring notion. But also you talk about irreducibility and there was another one, but I guess I was wanting you to kind of, I guess, elaborate a bit more on how you relate to unity, like when you say, that in searching for truth, and I guess in finding metaphysics central, that quest reduces to some unitary conception. What for you, yeah, is there more to it than that idea of like some common context for subjective points of view?
Yeah, I think like the reason that we have first have to make the link between this idea that unity or mirology, which is the study of wholes and parts. So that's more specific and more accurate here. We can develop that a little bit later. But first off, we have to make the link between why is truth even linked or related to this idea that everything has to be one or that there has to be one unit. And I think there's almost too simplistic of a reason for it. But and that's what makes it difficult to explain. But at the same time, let me put it this way. I think that truth, insofar as it is something we are trying to articulate as something that is tangible, it necessarily has to take on a quality. Now, the question is, what is that quality? Is it something quantifiable? So the relationship between quantity and quantification is where that comes in. So in order to, and I think the two are inextricable. My goodness. The moment that you have a quantity of something, you immediately are defining it through its qualities. And if you're touching upon a quality of something, well, you're using that quality as a unit. So ultimately, I think when you're trying to define anything, especially the most abstract thing, which could be truth, you're necessarily going to have to attribute to it either and or a quality and or quantity. And that's why there's a link between truth and the idea of unity here. Now, the question is, how can you say that truth, in fact, reduces to a unity and not a multiplicity? Well, because, we're experiencing truth as a multiplicity constantly. I mean, that's all we have all day long, right? In this reality, there are multiple objects, but all of those objects are participating in this one reality. And now, how to define the quality of that reality is where things become kind of complicated and you can get bogged down in epistemological nightmares and things like that. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to strip everything to this ultimate simplicity and just focus on this idea that if truth is going to be articulated in some fashion through quantification, then what is the simplest quantity that we can work with? And another question would be, if the world really is a multiplicity, well, what are those multiples made up of? What consists?
And that's partly what I was thinking is, that there's that question there around, I mean, if you think of existence as a unity, it does bring out that connotation of like, there's a question there around what is the unit of existence, right? What is that irreducible part of which every existing thing is made, even though obviously we have these different forms? Because that seems to be what's implied by the notion of a shared existential context, right? Is the idea that ultimately we're all of a piece, made of the same stuff in a way.
Mhm.
Then the question naturally becomes, what is that stuff? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so for me personally, I think that we have to divorce ourselves from the spatio-temporal construct entirely. When I'm saying that there is a unit of existence, I'm not talking about space-time in any fashion. Someone would say the universe is like a bubble, and that's the unit. But I don't judge it that way. I'm not talking about space-time here. I'm talking about existence, divorced from space and time. And a lot of people have to realize that there's multiple levels of nothingness. We can remove a lot of different things in reality until we arrive at a certain level of existence that is defined by things that are more abstract than space, time, and physics, right? Like possibility spaces, for example. I think George Ellis, some physicist from some university in South Africa, came up with this theory that there are spaces in which it really is the construct is that there are possibilities and there's nothing else. The possibilities out of which a space-time can emerge. So it's another kind of space that has nothing to do with physics. It's just made up of possibilities. Now that's highly, highly abstract. Now the question is, if it's multiple possibilities, but there's one sphere in which all those possibilities exist, it reduces to the same question. I mean, is it a multiplicity or a unitary aspect of truth? So I think like that's the first thing that's very important to realize is like existence isn't necessarily tied down to physics and matter. And second is that it tends to devolve into the inevitable wall of mereology, which is that the study of what does it mean, the relationship between one thing and its parts, its constituent parts, if it has any. And so, like what you said earlier about your transcendental ground, I think is actually more apt in that way because it says it's inclusive of the meaning here. You transcend, it's a transcendental ground, meaning there is no ground units upon which, like in the same fashion that we think of in terms of physics, it's transcendental even of ground. That's why maybe because this is a dialogos, I was going to ask you that. And I didn't have really the opportunity to. I didn't want to interrupt. But what do you mean when you say transcendental ground?
Yeah, I mean, when I say those words, what I'm thinking of is I'm thinking of that thing that everything else is due to. I suppose, like something that stands, like when we think of causality, grounding is like the prototype par excellence of causality. Grounding is the concept of there being a reason that makes other things so, right? Like a sufficient reason to make things the case. Yeah, grounding is the concept of that taken beyond the realm of the conceptual into the realm of actually making things so, and so it's a metaphor. Obviously, grounding comes from that on which something stands, that on which it depends is the abstract connotation there. And so that's why, when I think about it, it's that everything is due to the principle that nests everything else that is inside it, basically.
Yeah, the
Now,
ultimate
giving an
contingency.
exact form, well, I would think of it as the non-contingency that is the basis of everything contingent.
So like
Something
a prime
right.
mover.
Well, no, because prime mover suggests a temporal frame, right? Which is why I would differentiate efficient causation as a notion that, in a way, requires space time, right? Something comes before, something comes after. And actually, I wanted to ask you about this because you talked about rather than a hierarchical conception, right, like a lateral type conception. Because when I think of ontological dependency, I don't. It is still hierarchical, but it's just not. And so I wonder, like, how would you, when you are saying like a lateral dependency or something like that, what does that mean to you? How would you picture that
I'm not sure I can remember. You're pulling that from one of the things that you heard me say in the master class,
in
or
the master class? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I could tell you this
Because
first
because you
off.
kind of talked about like ontological dependency, and the concept that is popular is a hierarchical one, right?
Mhm,
Where like some things are more primary in that real sense of being
mhm.
first, right? But first
Yes.
has a temporal notion that goes with it.
Yes, yes, yes,
And
yes,
so,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, so I remember now. Thanks for jogging my memory. Yeah. I think that the uh the important thing here would be to mention language. I mean, we have no choice but to, based on the construction of our language, to speak in hierarchical terms. And also, reality as it presents itself to us functions in hierarchical manners. So it's very difficult for us to articulate something that is non hierarchical for that very reason. So that's just first thing off the bat. Second, I think that the reason why it's important to perhaps visualize it in a lateral fashion is so that you can start to help yourself divorce yourself away from this idea of space and time, because something that happens at the same time, space, in lateral fashion in parallel, it starts to give you a better hook into your intuitive ability to conceptualize this idea that ultimate reality encompasses all qualities and quantities in such a way that hierarchy hasn't even emerged yet, right? That hierarchy itself is an emergent phenomenon. But when I say emergent, it also leads back to this idea of causality. One thing causes another, right? Emerges from something. And again, you're stuck in this like spatiotemporal frame of mind. And even that is incorrect, but it's just one step closer, and
well, that's one of the reasons really that I like the term ground, and that I
yeah,
like the network of concepts that I tried to articulate around that is precisely because I'm conscious of that difficulty that, there is this idea of a first mover that, and which is inherently moving is an inherently spatio-temporal concept. You know what I mean? It,
that's
it,
right.
it
Motion.
already sort of presupposes the whole frame it's trying to explain. So for me, it's like, obviously there has to be something that doesn't depend on anything else, that because of the identity that it has just is the case because there aren't any alternatives. And
Mhm.
that everything else that exists has to be in some way entailed by that. But to think of it as a first mover, like, it exactly like you were kind of pointing to, that risk about kind of insinuating the spatiotemporal frame, like the first mover thing is exactly that. Like, it's an idea of, it's like half the good idea, right? It's the transcendental ground idea, but then there's an idea of like pushing, right? Really, it is that idea, pushing dominoes, making like an impetus, imparting an impetus, which is like so misleading because existence never needs to get started. It always is the case. It cannot fail to be the case. So it never needs to get moving. That's, yeah,
Yeah, motion, like, it's intrinsic to it to begin with. It's not like motion never was at some point and then it just started, you know?
exactly.
I think that if you think about things like time, motion, space, distance, all that stuff, these are all to me qualities. They're qualitative of existence and they exist within it. Of course, I like to envelop there being a void, an ontological void within that framework of existence. But aside from that disagreement that you and I have, I see things exactly the same way that you do in that way. Like everything else is consistent. But I am curious now, like about how you go about describing this level of reality that is free from space and time. How do you incorporate that into your datalogical framework?
Yeah, well, I
Which
mean,
came
that's,
first, data or logic? Or they came together and
yeah.
how does space-time emerge or exist within data logic, for example?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of ask you about is this idea of possibility spaces, because that's very resonant with my own framework. I mean, like the way I think about it, I mean, is that, so obviously there's the transcendental ground. Just call that data logic. That's my name for it. So the idea would be that neither, it's like codependent origination, except the origination part is like, it's more like, like an inseparable, irreducible pair every time. I actually think of, I think it's gluons, right? Like when you try and pull them apart, the energy you impart in order to pull them apart, like, regenerates the gluon pair, right? I think about it like that. Like, it's impossible to pull them apart because every attempt to do so just creates another matrix of the exact same constituents to kind of frame it in. There's no way of getting out of this substance, structure, form, essence type relationship. And then, so for me, it's like, I think about, okay, so there's like, absolutely, right? There's some data that like actually really is the case, right? And that data has this kind of relational structure to it, right? Where it's like, it kind of embeds the nature of possibility. And partly how it does that is, in order for something to actually absolutely be the case, right? It's obviously got to be possible in the first place. Like, it's got to make sense. It's got to be like consistent. We would say that's the
Yeah.
condition of
But is
possibility.
it one unit of data or is it a multiplicity of
Well, so the idea for me is that the ground is data and logic, like, as just a pair, as because it's not like a pair is in a way misleading, right? Because it is a unity. It's not separable, right? So you can't have substance without structure. You can't have essence without form. So it is just the one thing. It is just like an atom or a pixel, an iota, right? Something that absolutely is. But the idea is, because it has this structure to it, because it can't like be non-contingent without having some kind of structure, right? There's this sense of, okay, it's like actually absolutely real and it's logically possible. But then there's this type of data which is like a contextual or embedded within or entailed by, which is like logically possible, but not absolutely real, right? Not real at the level of the most absolute reality, not actually manifest without exception, right? Because it's not without exception. It's entailed within this data logic, this relationship that the thing has to itself, this contextual, basically, like, as there is something that absolutely has to be the case, then there's an idea of an echo, or like an echo is a good metaphor, like a hall of mirrors type idea of that, where it's like, okay, then there's every way that could be. None of those actually are, right? Because there's no particular way for it to be any particular way. So it isn't any particular way. But by not being any particular way, by just being actually absolutely there, it entails a logical context, which is like logically possible data, right? Theoretical data, different ways that the world could be. That's what I relate to as a possibility space. For me, it's like the data logical absolute embeds within itself a possibility space. I think of it like a multiverse of every logically possible way that things could be, but in fact aren't. And so it's like the fact that things always are a certain way always has this relationship with itself where it produces the right, like the total manifestation of all possibilities.
Okay, so is that like data and logic are the prime qualities of the ground of reality?
I don't know. Qualities, I feel like qualities is a concept that's downstream from what data and logic are, I guess. For me, data and logic is like the formula of the fundamental constituents of
Huh.
everything that could
So
possibly.
data as a concept, not as an actual tangible unit.
Well, the formula, insofar as it like names an ontological reality,
Yeah.
right? Like the thing I like about data is that it's not specific as to the form, which leaves it totally open, radically open as to the actual content. But what we definitely do have is this notion of non-contingency, something that can't fail to be the case. That's the actual quality, so to speak, to use an analogical term, of existence, is this the fact that it cannot possibly not be. That's what existence is. Existence just is. It's just there. That's how it works.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to pin down data and how it relates to mereology. Like, is data a unit that is on its own, that is unified with logic, or is data logic just one unit and it's two aspects of the.
Data and logic. So, like, you talk sometimes in that masterclass about contrast, right? And in this case, it's not. I'm not necessarily appealing to contrast, but it is that idea of being defined in relation to something other. And that's what data and logic are. Like, that's partly what I mean by the gluon idea. Is in order even to make sense of the concept of data, you already have to presuppose some structural notion. In order to even make sense of the concept of structure, you already have to presuppose something in which the structure inheres, some substance, right? Some essence, something that takes a certain form. Form doesn't mean anything apart from a notion of something that takes a form.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm starting to get that. It's just I feel it's a bit confusing because you tend to think of data as something of a unit of something versus just like a container for
Yeah, so
many
well,
units.
as a unit, I think of it as like, I guess, like I said, a pixel maybe of uninterpreted information, right? So you can think of the world as made up of information. The thing I don't personally like about the term information is that it insinuates interpretation. Inform, right, is something your mind does. It informs itself. It structures the data, so to speak, in a certain way to make it intelligible to you. The thing that exists out in the world before you go and look for it, say the fossils in the ground or the conditions of a lake no one's ever been to, that's what I think of as data, right? The information that constitutes the environment before you turn it into information by observing it, interacting with it, measuring it. And then there's an
So it's out of formation. Data is literally out of formation, and then information is that it's rendered intelligible by through logic. Is that right?
yes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. Now that's the question. That which is out of formation, is it one substance or is it a multiplicity of substances?
Yeah, somehow it's both, and that's one of the very curious things about my study, at least, of existence, is that somehow it's like, as much as I like DM theory, data logical metaphysical theory, for making sense of, for me, like a really clean kind of way of thinking about what existence is, and nonetheless, like my broader studies commit me to the conclusion that like the signature of existence is paradoxical unity. And like I kind of always knew that, you know what I mean? Because that's what you're searching for in metaphysics, is some integrating notion. Unfortunately, in order to make good sense, you have to exclude things, right? And that's part of the problem, is that by excluding things, some of the things that are probably possible in reality get kind of sort of bracketed by your way of talking about it. And then all of a sudden it's like
Yeah.
you've got a box.
See, this is
And you're
interesting.
fixed
This is
in a
why,
box.
for me, the whole paradoxism is important because it has the opposing assumption that you have to include everything. I know, to make sense. And actually that's very straightforward logic. Like it's logical that you must include everything that is at play. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's why I include void and ontological nothingness, because it is paradoxical in itself, but you can see why, like you said, somehow it is both a unity and a multiplicity at the same time. There's a superposition. Could you say that that superposition is the absolute unity that is indivisible? No, because the whole point of it is that it can multiply itself. So there's like this higher, infinitely regressive truth to the foundation of reality. And then you could say, is that infinite regress the unity? And then it's like an infinite regress of an infinite regress, because you could keep saying, well, yeah, that infinite regress exists as the ground upon which you can have multiplicity. So it is both one and many at the same time. And that's what I was trying to tell you with those first few episodes we had with infinite regress squared. And then you could just stop it there and be like, oh, there is this like escape velocity in which there is an infinitely regressive structure that has, an infinite amount of infinitely regressive structures. And so you got to stop somewhere, and to stop describing it. And
Uh,
that's why, like, yeah, some people default to like, hey, just shut the fuck up. It's just, there's nothing to be said. Remain still and observe, and you will arrive at truth. And it's true as well. But the interesting thing is, like, that there you are doing it. And there you are in this dimension needing to articulate and operate and make decisions and all these things. And that requires you to make statements about the nature of reality to justify the decisions you're going to make. So, we've just kind of gone to the most abstracts precisely to be able to understand how to properly behave in the most pragmatic sense. And that's why I don't think that what we're doing is like just abstract, kind of useless stuff. This is actually the most in depth you can get to be able to arrive at the best pragmatic way of living your life, or making decisions, or understanding anything, making sense of things. So, to me, I think that you can accept paradoxes insofar as you are saying that everything's paradoxical, or you can accept paradoxes insofar as saying that, in fact, paradoxes are entirely logical and very simple. And that's where, like, I've changed my flavor over time. I used to like default to, well, everything is paradoxical, and you're just gonna have to accept that you're gonna, think of it that way. But then over time, I realized that, in fact, uh, uh, logic itself is paradoxical, because everything we're saying so far, because again, we're talking about truth insofar as it reduces to a unity, and then you fall into the study of mirology, right? The relationship between one and its constituent parts. And so ultimately you are trying to observe the logic behind, how does unity exist? Does it exist as a multiplicity? And if it does, how can it be that way if it's supposed to be a unity? That's where the paradox comes in. So then you're realizing that the search for truth really does collapse to an actual observation and an investigation into the nature of logic, not data. Logic and how it works will eventually lead you, in my estimation, because it led me to that, to the fact that to the statement, it will show you that I am paradoxical. And by symmetry of identity, you would say then that paradoxes are logical, and that logic is therefore paradoxical. So there's like a lateral, if we bring that back, there's a lateral relationship between logic and paradox insofar as that is the linchpin. So to me, it's not data and logic, it would be like logic and paradox, because at the end of the day, they're the same thing. I mean, a paradox is a logical framework. It's just one that exists outside of the logical framework that we operate by. But I think they're
Yeah, but I'm not. Well, to be fair, with
yeah,
data, I'm not trying to name the logical aspect of it. I'm trying to separate as much as possible the stuffness from
yeah.
the way, the mode.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think that our endeavors are necessarily, what do you call it, confrontational. I think they're complementary, for the very reason that, what I'm trying to understand is simply the relationship between unity and multiplicity, and that I think that involves having to understand the relationship between logic and paradox. Whereas what you're doing is trying to understand, how does the world materialize, or how is it self-consistent, and that's a much bigger,
I don't
like,
know. To be honest,
difficult.
I'm more interested these days in the project that you mentioned, the
Mm,
unity, multiplicity.
mhm.
More and more in my explorations of synchronicity, mostly. But philosophy and the world more generally. You know, the guy who told me about synchronicity, he once put it like, he kind of said, all these contradictions fit together in some kind of logical way
Mhm.
because they're part of the world,
Yeah.
right? Your job obviously is to try to figure out how that can be possible. How can it be possible?
How is the
And that's difficult,
how is
you
the
know.
impossible possible? And
Exactly. And that's why point towards this signature. I like that word because it's not obvious. It comes at the end, right? It's like the mark, the authorization mark, the realization, the insight, the thing that actually vindicates the whole treatise, the contract, right? There's a signature of paradoxical unity. But the puzzle is, how is that? How?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
the one and the many. It doesn't seem on the face of it. It's like, no, it actually can't be both ways. What does that even mean?
It
Like, it's so bizarre.
it
But it
can't
actually is both ways, though.
That's exactly it. It can't be both ways on one side of the logical, like there's a gate, right? In one framework of logic, it can't, because within the classical logic, you have the law of the excluded middle, right? It either has to be one or the other. There's no in between, there's no nuance. The logical framework by which we operate here in this dimension. And that's why, like, we tend to think in terms of this is paradoxical when you think of the unity also being a multiplicity at the same time. It's like that can't be. But how? But we know that it is at the same time, and that's what's interesting to me. Is like, how can you know that the impossible is, and at the same time know that the impossible can't be? And that's because there are paraconsistent sets of logic. That's when you start to dance with the idea that logic itself isn't just one game. Logic is, in a higher sense, that you could say there's paradoxical logic, there's logic A, B, and C, and ad infinitum. So then you realize, logic isn't actually this consistent set of laws by which we function in this reality, in base reality or whatever. That there are all other consistent sets of logic, if you will, and they appear to us through the experience of paradoxes. But if we, for example, could just like zip up in a suit and like enter those dimensions and have the ability to conceptualize that logic, perhaps the experience in consciousness wouldn't be paradoxical at all. It would be straightforward, the way straightforward logic is here: 1 + 1 = 2, and that's it. And so I think that the closest we can get may not be to be able to perceive that paradox as if though it was translated into classical logic, but we can at least stand 1 foot on that side and 1 foot on this side. And
Yeah, I like that.
if you can do that, then if you can stay there, then I do think that there you have a handle on articulating truth in a certain way. Not to say that you are encapsulating it in an absolute sense, like you've captured it with a certain sequence of words, right, or logical equation. No, but you are able to articulate truth in certain ways, and perhaps in an infinite amount of ways that are very, very potent and useful to us. And I don't know if that is something that is true or not, if we want to kick it into a meta level. But at the end of the day, it is fun, it is meaningful. It is that which we are capable of doing. It's that extra possibility that we're discovering or maybe even creating to be able to do that. And I think that's beautiful.
Amplifies
All right.
possibility.
That's right. Dude. See, this is why, like, you're on the pragmatic sense of things, and so as much as you're moving toward like the paradoxical side of things, I'm actually moving toward your side of things. So that's kind of beautiful, because I am thinking like, okay, great. I think I have a handle, intuitively speaking, on you know truth insofar as it exists as an investigation into logic and paradox and the study of wholes and parts and all that stuff. But like, what do I do with that? Well, synchronicity, baby. That's what you do with that. You know what I mean? You go off and you play. Once you learn the rules of the game, what else is there to do but to play? So I think that if you and I are able to articulate that and meet somewhere to be able to like bring on more players into this field of to play, this would be pretty fun. And that's the game that you and I seem to be playing.
Absolutely, yeah, no, that sounds awesome to me. I mean, group work around resonance, around synchronistic discussions. Like I said, it amplifies possibility, and I don't mean that as a kind of like a woo-woo kind of conceptual like I've read in a book that this is possible. I mean, I've experienced it. I've experienced building a resonance chamber through consistent resonant interactions, and I've experienced it amplify possibility, amplify signals, have random people who have nothing to do with the kind of conversations that are happening, these
Yeah.
consistent conversations, these life-changing conversations, got nothing to do with it, that just echo. Recently I saw this, or I started reading
Yeah,
this book,
let me ask you a
or
question then. When you build these resonance chambers with other people, did it transcend logic in any way? Like, this isn't logical.
oh, see, and that's partly why I brought it up is, synchronicity for me is a real balancing. It balances out. Like when I think of DM theory and data logic, what I think of is it's a closed box type thing where it's like it's a closed circuit. It explains everything within certain limits perfectly, and I think it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's flawless. I haven't been able to identify something wrong with it. It really does do that within its certain limits thing. But the thing is, existence is so much more complicated than that. And so then there's
Yeah,
another set of tools, right, which I think of as like an open box, open source kind of ontology, that's more related to integrating all the different phenomenal realities that I'm investigating through synchronicity, through my study of magic and the occult, through
yeah.
my study of history and religion and spirituality. I'm trying to weave together some kind of a story that actually makes sense of where we are, where we've
Yeah.
come from, what's going on here.
Well, it's
Um,
almost as if though you've delineated that black box really, really well, and that this within the realms of this set of logical rules, this is how it works. You've given it its identity, its integrity, and then yeah, because a limit always implies that which is beyond it. You've gone off at the same time and been like, okay, great, what's outside of this box? And there's all the other boxes, there's all these other fields and weird things
yeah.
that are happening, right? So do I take that as an answer to say yes, that some of these resonance chamber experiences you've had proven that it just transcended logic in some fashion?
So transcended logic is,
That it was illogical?
the difficulty is it's like it's a balance because I'm maintaining both of these things. You
Mm,
see what I mean? So it's like I really do still think I've never been given a good reason to think reality can't be boiled down to the black box idea. But then there's this whole set of experiences that the black box idea just isn't useful for talking about or thinking about. And these experiences matter a lot. And not only that, but according to the black box idea, most of this is not possible. And so it's wrong somehow, even though it's fucking totally right.
yeah,
Absolutely bizarre. You
that's
know what
what I'm
I
saying.
mean?
It's
It's
not
wrong. And
bizarre.
it just can't be relied on. And
It,
so I can't use that when I'm in territory that relates to open box phenomenology, like to constrain in advance what's possible based on my understanding is just as a rule forbidden.
yeah. No, that's what's beautiful about it. I think that the fact that it can both be right and wrong at the same time goes to prove my point that there is the possibility for closed boxes, and that possibility only exists contingent on there being a reality in which there are multiple possibilities for closed boxes, and that there's an open world. And so, like, to me, there's nothing inconsistent there. I think that it,
Yes, it's just the difficulty is that the gravity pulls totally different ways. Like the gravity of a closed box system is to want to think this totally encapsulates everything. That's the logic of it.
yeah,
That's how it's supposed
but
to
it
work.
exists within an open world, and that open world is
No, I know, but
encompassing. It
the
is an
thought is
absolute, right?
it's like the thought is that it's like the core, right? The black box is supposed to be a perfect model of the core, whatever that is. And the thought is that the core and the surface are going to be essentially the same, right? As the Tao Te
Yeah,
Ching
but the
says.
core also implies that it is not in the entire thing. So, like, if you're looking for an absolute, then look no further. To me, there's this idea that the black box has to want to say that there's an absolute self-contained thing. You just apply that very notion to the open world, and you just have to accept that in fact the quality of the absolute is not a closed box. It is an open world.
This is the strange thing.
Yeah.
And this is why I say the signature of it is a paradoxical unity is yes, it is though. There is something to that idea. of like coming up with a perfect model of the core and getting a perfect extended holographic projection of what everything is going to be like. Like that actually does work. Somehow is like that,
Yeah.
but it's also not like that. It's also not at all like that. It's also so different from that that totally distorts the way things really are. But it's also that. That's the
Yeah. Yeah.
mind-boggling.
That's why I love paradoxes, man, because I'm like, it feels like that's the magic within the like the flat, straightforward, kind of boring logic. It's kind of like a magic trick. The moment that you see it, like when you see it, you're just blown away, and you experience something real. But the moment that you know how the trick is done, that magic evaporates, and it feels weird because it's like, well, that reality that I had before I knew the trick never really existed. But how can it be? The experience is there, the memory is there, everything else is there, so it exists in some capacity. And so, to me, the fact that reality presents itself this way, it's mind-boggling, but there's nothing about it that is wrong or incomplete or insufficient. That's just
Yeah. Well, the thing I love about that analogy is that it's illustrative in how it falls short. Because a magician, obviously, in the modern sense, is an illusionist, right? And the magic trick of reality is that it's not a trick, right? Is that somehow it really is that way. Somehow before, you didn't understand, and then it seemed like magic, and then it doesn't
dude.
seem like magic, but
Let me just get my gun for you just put the last bullet in this that this is actually not a trick on top of it. That's it. That's the bullet to end everything. What you just said there, there's no arguing against that. I mean, like, it's over. You're absolutely right. The fact that it's not a magic trick, it just is that way, is like you are forced to your knees to stop having to think about it. And that's why I was saying that I think that all these theories of truth is like they're ladders that you use and discard. Because once you've arrived at the experience of it, you have to discard the ladder because otherwise you're going to drive yourself insane, which is fine too. But
yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm half insane already because I love that idea. And I love Wittgenstein, brilliant man. And it's true, and it's like I said, you can never allow the ladder to constrain your the experience, because the experience is something over and above whatever you've made your ladder out of. The experience is like the originary source, that mystical experience where you touch the interconnectedness, right? That transcends any kind of reduction to a framework you can fit inside your head. And yet, it's hard to let go of a really good ladder.
yeah, but see, I think that this is the thing. I think that for me, at least with my theory, it's not a ladder. It's a door. Like it is a door that allows me to climb out of my logical mind. That puts me in. It's like a doorway between the black box and the open world within which it sits. Versus like a ladder to get from an arbitrary point A to an arbitrary point B. And so
Well,
so to me, it's like imagine being able to climb through the ladder that leads you to the door in the black box, which is why I think converging your theory and mine is important, because you first need to be able to define the black box, the logical world, the rules within which you begin, to then finally be able to find that door. And once you climb the ladder of the black box that is DM theory, then you can approach the door and be like, great, I have the black box, it is true. Now what's on the outside of it? Here's the door. Then you end up in the open world and there's nothing else to be
oh,
said. That's why I don't really have much. There isn't that
yeah, I
much to
think.
derive from paradoxism other than, hey, there's a door to an open world here.
I mean, it's interesting. The latter thing, I was just extending the analogy, which
Yeah.
again, for anyone who doesn't know, is borrowed from Wittgenstein. He makes that analogy in his Tractatus, right at the end. For me, like in terms of how do I really relate to, so there's a couple of conceptual paradigms that I think of when I think of like what my metaphysics is to me.
Yeah.
And chiefly among them is like a philosopher's stone. So something that helps me to extract value out of anything, basically. Because it gives me something always, even no matter how confused I am, there's something I can come back to, a piece of solid ground. That's partly why I call it, it's a stone, in that it's solid in that way. It doesn't move. It stays exactly the way it is. It always makes exactly the kind of sense that it makes. So, and that's really useful actually if you like to, say, experiment with psychedelics, or you like to kind of do the kinds of like psychological experiments that might put your sanity in question, say. It's very useful to have something, and existential questioning and all of that can very much derange you compared to make you not fit in, make you very strange in the things you want to talk about and your mannerisms and etc. And I think it's really useful to have something to reorient to, something that makes sense not just to you, but to everyone, as something to come back to. And so in that sense, I think of it like, I guess when I think of existential anxiety and feeling lost, I think of being adrift in the ocean in a storm. And so then I think of DM theory. DM theory is like an anchor. It's like I've got an anchor down. So the storm, it's like there's a storm. I can only move so far. And there's something really reassuring about that, actually. And so, yeah, those are two really prominent frames for me or another way you can think of it is you're like in the middle of the ocean or whatever. It's like a piece of dry land, right? You sit on that dry land, you're safe. You don't, you're not going to drown or,
Mm.
yeah. So for me, that's more how I would relate to it. So the latter thing, it's like that. There's something to that characterization. That's why I like it. Is that's what it's like for at the beginning when you have a revelatory insight that crystallizes into a framework. There is a climbing up feeling and a surveying, and then there's that. And like I said, like I don't disagree with the insight that there's something that the best way to experience that height is to throw away the ladder. However, like I said, for me, it's like I'm stubborn about, like holding on to my gains, and I don't want to. It's like I don't want to follow someone else's path. If I think I can carry the ladder, and I don't want to let go of that, because that actually, like, maybe I'll find another mountain and that I can climb, and then see something that would be remarkable that I mightn't have climbed without it. I don't know. To me, it's like if I've got something of value that works for me, I'm not going to just throw it away. I
Mm.
totally understand the insight, and I don't disagree with it, because, like I said, never am I going to if I have to put the ladder down in order to go into the experience, that is what I'll do. But I'll come back for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, we're tied to the having to live as human beings with a certain set of rules. So we do need that, clearly. Some kind of tether maybe would be a better analogy, but
Yeah, tether is a great one. Yeah,
yeah. No, no, for sure. For sure. But now we're getting kind of more abstract with our theories that people might not have
sure.
investigated at
Yeah,
all.
that definitely. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, we could refocus it a little bit. Like, truth is one of those things that I don't know how much of the discussion you read. The section on theories of truth was a bit repetitive and long. Partly repetitive because I wrote it over the series of like 3 or 4 months, so
Mhm.
it's hard to remember exactly which points you've already made properly. You know what I mean? But so, in that part of what I talk about, at least in the beginning, where I open it up, is that people who study theories of truth can be like the theories that come out of people who are concerned about it can be very helpfully organized by a frame that I got from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which sort of separates them into people who are concerned about what they call the metaphysical or essence project, right? What truth really is. And then people who are concerned about a speech act or justification project, which is like, what do we mean when we use the word truth? And what kind of conditions should we impose on people who are using it, and etc.
I
And so
think
I guess,
when you say that, I'm just thinking to me that I think we have to understand that, especially at this level of definition, truth is synonymous with real. What we're getting at really when we say the word truth is what is real, what exists, what is like, what is the being and
yeah,
what
yeah,
is
yeah.
tangible. Because you can have true or false within a framework.
I like locally manifest.
Yeah, wow. That implies a lot of complexity. I mean, complexity that we'd have to dig into. But it's an interesting one, locally manifest. But you know what I mean? Like fact that you can,
Real serves well.
because if you're thinking just in binary terms of true and in contrast to true, you have false. Well, then false has to be true insofar as it is what gives truth its definition. And that's another paradoxical thing we can observe. Point is, when you're trying to arrive at absolute truth or trying to understand like the ground of reality, then really truth is already a bit of a diluted word. We shouldn't be using true, we should be using the word real, right? What is real? What is the fundamental thing that is real that allows us to have a world within which there's this strange paradox at play wherein both the false counterpart to a truth has to be true in order for true to be true. Like that's fucking amazing. It's again mind blowing. But you see what I mean? Like true and false uh is I think, a few steps too far. That what we're doing is actually trying to understand what is real.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, when I try to define any term in that complex, so I locate that term within a little network of very dense root notions: real, true, existence, being, isness, presence. Yeah, maybe one or two more. Very fundamental concepts, very difficult to define, all related in one way or another. Some synonymous, some almost exact, but different in a tiny way. So for me, it's like you have to do the whole network. You can't. It's very difficult to kind of say, okay, what we need to do is we need to focus on real, because part of what real means is only brought out by distinguishing it from a concept like true, for example.
Well, yeah, well, that's what I'm saying, and I think that, like, well, you're right to push on that point, and I think, like, real has to do is tied to being, right, with that which exists, so something, and I'm by that I mean tangible, and tangible
Yeah,
not necessarily
tangible.
in a physical.
That's why I say locally manifest,
Yeah.
because it's there.
That's what I
It's
mean,
there.
but I'm saying that whatever is tangible insofar as it is exists, it is in that framework, that truth is something that exists within it. It's a smaller version of real. It's like you said, all these words are so similar. I think that they're so similar for the very reason that they are the same thing, but on different levels of analysis. That true and false is really only something that happens at a lower resolution, right? At a more our level. But the more abstract you go, then you go into these words that are a bit more encompassing. Like, I think that real.
Well, I mean, I kind of agree with you, but it's
Yeah,
also like all of these words have more general, universal notions attached to them. So, for
yeah,
instance, we could say real and true, and then we could say, okay, well, real. There's reality, right, which is like a totalizing notion, and similarly, you could think of truth with a capital T. Similarly, totalizing notion has a lot in common with the notion of the object of existence, right? And so it's like, to some degree, what for me, it's like, yes, there's a levels thing going on in levels of abstraction in the terms, but you kind of have to map that vertical dimension of abstraction. Again, it's like you have to map the whole
yeah,
network of terms.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
impossible to get a sense for what's going on without doing that.
Yeah, and then you realize that another way to go about it would be to not even include these words at all, because that's the epistemological nightmare. You have to define, and every definition requires its own definition. I read this book called Information. I think that was just the title straight up. And in it, he was talking about the lexicographers, the very first ones, or whatever you call those people who were like building the dictionary at first. And they were running upon, like, it was really fascinating how it was tied to data and information. This is something you really should read. But he was trying to talk about how, like, we run into this problem of the definition of definitions, and that it's at some point you have to just select some base unit upon which you can go and define everything else, but you have to stop somewhere. And when you're trying to encompass truth in the greatest articulation so that it stops that infinitely regressive thing, well, you realize either I have to include as many words as we already have in these abstraction type definitions and, like, map their relationships and define them very, very cleanly, or you get rid of them entirely and you just select one, or you make them all just the same thing. Existence, truth, real, all that stuff just becomes synonymous so that you can just work with, the base unit. And that's the road that I had taken when I was trying to understand reality insofar as it is an experience that I'm having, is just keep it to the simplest base units that I have. I have existence, I have void, and I have consciousness. The boiling it down, really. And I was like, fuck the epistemological nightmare. And I don't know if and I think you've done the opposite, where you really well defined these words and then you were able to create this structure that was like foolproof. Is that right?
Supposedly, yeah. I mean, that's the goal. That's the goal. How foolproof it is, we'll see. Only time will tell.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, I think we're both very recursive. If you have a recursive mind, you're always tempted to go back and be like, did I define that word properly? And if you find like the least bit of doubt, then your whole fucking thing crumbles. That's why I didn't like that. I was like, man, if just one of these words are out of place in their relationship to the others, or in its definition, it is impure in some fashion, or not consistent with the logic at play,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have to
yeah.
start all over again. And it's just like a nightmare. So I was like, okay, what's the other way that I could do it? I don't think I have I think you have the stamina and the mental capacity to be able to see these relationships in a grander scale. I don't think I have that ability.
I think I also just got lucky. Like I said, the coming on data and logic, for me, that's a lucky stroke. It just so happens that you can get a very tractable explanation out of that is very like apt to be reformulated in light of, because it's so general, right? Data and logic, it could almost mean anything. That's what I love about it. Is it's not specific as to the structure, it's not specific as to the nature of the content. It just names the fact that there has to be something and just calls
Yeah.
that generically
You
data.
you generate, like, there's an element of arbitrariness to it, to the structure you came up with, but the fact that you demonstrated that there is some level of consistency that makes things, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Legible, not legible. It just makes things
Eligible.
intelligible is the word, yeah, is like an interesting way to arrive at it. But again, for me, the reason why that wasn't satisfactory was because I want to know, why is it arbitrary? Like, I don't want arbitrariness, I want absoluteness, right? But but I think that it's possible to view a self-contained system like you've built that is flawless insofar as it is intelligible and self-consistent, and that even though it's arbitrary, it shows you that even though it stands true to this reality in which, if it works on this level, it works on the highest of levels. It's a reflection, in other words. So I see the appeal in that.
Oh
It
yeah,
doesn't,
yeah.
that arbitrary loses its meaning when you realize that what it is doing is it's reflecting the absolute. And the absolute is not
Yeah.
arbitrary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The element of vagueness to it is just a function of the scope, the economy of scale that it achieves. You can't achieve an economy of scale like that unless you have a degree of play in
Uh,
how exactly you cash out the idea. I wanted to return though, because you said something before about we're going a fair bit back here, but about kind of the infinite regressive idea. Because I'm always fascinated by this, because it's like we have so much overlap in our understanding, right? And then in some areas we're just totally opposite. Because like for me, it's like the infinite regression. Like the way I think about that is like the whole point of the ground is that an infinite regression can never be self-explanatory. Is basically the intuition. Is that if you have an infinite regression, it calls out for a ground, because even if you have a chain that goes on forever, why is the chain the case, right? Like something has to make things be the way they are. That's, I guess, the basic thought behind grounding. And there has to be that something. That something is the ground. That's how people relate to
yeah.
it. And so I guess for me, it's like, and it's interesting because I like the idea of an infinite regression, except if it's not regressive. So the way I think about it is infinite progression. So I think about specifically the way I conceptualize, I guess, like the data logical matrix, or that possibility space or whatever, is it embeds inwards and descends inwards in a way endlessly. So there's a regression that goes, but it's progressive. It doesn't go backwards forever, because
It
it's
goes
like
forwards.
yeah, forwards. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
okay.
creates
Now
new possibilities.
Now I can pin down the issue at play. I think that you're looking at infinite regress in a two-dimensional fashion, backwards and forwards, because yeah, you're looking at it as a chain.
Well, that's what regression means, though.
Yeah, yeah,
Regression means to go back.
it does mean to go backwards, and I think that it's good for me to clarify this now, because yeah, it implies a two-dimensional sphere, whereas how I see infinite regression is it's self-referential, which you could also, it closes that two-dimensional gap, and goes deeper
Like
one
the
level,
Ouroboros.
and goes to one. It goes to one thing. I see infinite regress as an absolute, and the reason we see it as a regression or progression is precisely because of, we function in 3D, right? And so we're stuck on 1, 2, and 3. But here's where for me the infinite regress is an absolute, and it's not there's no halting problem or anything like that. It's because you have to look at the Munchausen trilemma. We mentioned before the arbitrary starting point, which is also actually it's called the Agrippin trilemma originally, trilemma of Agrippa. But it was basically that when trying to describe truth, you run into three problems, right? Which is an arbitrary starting point, an infinite regress, and the third was, help me out here.
Circularity.
Circularity, that's right, circular reasoning or teleology, right? And to me, infinite regress, at least its problem, the way you perceive it, is resolved when you look at the Agrippin trilemma not as a problem, but as a feature, that these three things are integrated and they function together. and then it's no longer a regress at that point. So you're right. Just
Can
like
you paint
you,
that picture? What does that look like?
yeah, okay. So because like just like you, I wasn't satisfied with regress. I was trying to get away from infinite regress. But you can't get away from infinity. And infinity functions in a progressive and or regressive manner, at least in the two dimensions. But if you bump it up into an abstraction where it's not about moving forward or backward or in however many directions, it's about there being an absolute or an eternal quality. So, eternity and infinity reflect each other in that way, which is why we perceive it as regressive. But that's only because we're perceiving it through our two-dimensional perspective. So, in order to get out of that perspective and shoehorn yourself out of it, you have to see the trilemma as a I had recently said it's not a trilemma, it's a trifecta. Okay. Because when you realize that all arbitrary starting points are actually the most relevant, they're all absolute, then you realize there's no such thing as arbitrariness. When you realize that circularity is not an error or a flaw in human reasoning. It is, in fact, the intuitive grasp on, it's a function, it's a type of reasoning that we have as a quality, as an actual feature, because that is how reality works. It is self referential. There is a circularity to it. And then the last point, which is the regress, you have the infinity and you can drop the regress at that point because you realize that regress has just to do, is only relevant insofar as it is a quality that we experience within our spatial temporal constructs. And that's why if we're going to apply spatial temporal framework or mindset to reality as it is, which is supra spatial temporal, well, of course, it's going to look like a regress or progress or, backwards or forwards, but really that's not relevant. So does that clarify things a little bit? Or have I made things worse?
Never make things worse, my friend. What it brings to my mind is a few different things actually. The Ouroboros. I'm not sure if you've seen Loki, the TV show.
No.
Amazing story. In that they have like a sacred timeline, and it's like a loop. And actually there's a, and this is something I actually had in my notes to bring up because it's really interesting. There's a quote I'd love to get your thoughts on. It's actually something I came up with that then I learned later as was already a quote, which is, considering the content of it, pretty interesting. So the quote is, existence is a sphere whose boundary is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. Yeah.
I think that might be Parmenides who might have said that.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Really interesting. I'd love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I read it. I think I read that as well. Can you repeat it? It's
Yeah, I actually said it the wrong way around. It's existence is a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose boundary is nowhere.
there you go. Yeah, that's precisely what I'm talking about. But then you've kicked it up another level, right? Because you're talking about a three-dimensional sphere. Sphere is three-dimensional. An infinite timeline is two-dimensional. And so the point is to think about it outside of all dimensions and just as an abstract, purely distilled concept. And then it makes sense because then you realize this doesn't apply to space and time precisely because it is, pre-spatial temporal or outside of it or grander than it.
The phrase, instead of infinite regression, infinite transgression occurred to me.
That's great. I like that because we are transgressing against the nature of reality when we think, well, it's got to be, stopped somewhere or it's got to, come after something. Like, no, that's a transgression indeed. I love that. I love that. And, this might really set me up for being able to finally clearly explain what I mean by infinite regress squared, which is to say that when you force yourself to look at things using the same logic in this two-dimensional way, like there's a regress happening, well, then you realize like there's a regress of the regress, right? Because you can always say, well, okay, I'm going to put something to stop the regression, but then there's a regress to that as well. It's just to show you that regress, it falls prey to the infinite aspect at play because that's the whole nature of infinity. It does not stop. So regress doesn't make any sense to begin with, to be like, oh, there has to be a prime mover or a base at play. It's like, no, you're talking about infinity here. There is no such thing. So yeah, you can regress or progress all you want. That's just an axis of possibility within that timeline. That's all you're referring to. If you're trying to stop that regress, that's what's really crazy because you're saying infinite regress. So you're implying right away that there is no possibility to stop the regress. So this is what I'm trying to say is infinite regress of infinite regress. hopefully it's like a reductio ad infinitum as a tool, but you're really doing it like exponentially so you know, so that you can finally come up to the logical conclusion, okay, if there's an infinite regress of infinite regresses on top of that, well, that's eternal. I mean, then you realize there's an eternal aspect, that if there's anything that binds the infinite timeline, if you still insist on looking at it in two-dimensional terms, well, it would be the fact that it is eternally this way, that there is no halting infinity and encapsulating it in that way, because its prime, or one of its qualities, is that it is eternal. And then you have to go and define eternity, right? But eternal is that which has no qualities but encompasses all qualities. Infinity is just a reflection of that, is all the qualities within that eternity that has no qualities. That's why I see like they're two mirrors, eternity and infinity. But
Interesting. That sounds like a proprietary definition. I would usually think of eternity as outside of time, beyond time,
no, I
something
would
like
say
that.
infinity is precisely all of that, all of the qualities that the pleroma contains is infinity. Infinity to me
Well,
is,
no, that unpacking makes sense to me
yeah,
because infinity embodies this quality of fullness, of abundance, overabundance, superabundance. But specifically, the thing I was wondering about was eternity. Eternity, say when you call something eternal, typically what you mean is it always exists. Obviously, one way of thinking of that is at every moment in time, it's there. That is one sense of eternal. But it
yeah,
seems like the more primitive sense is like this thing is not subject to time.
that's right. To me, eternity is, we think about it in terms of space time again because it's a nagging thing where that's the condition that we're in. Eternity is the quality, the only quality we can attribute to it is that it is without qualities and yet contains all qualities. And when we say it contains all qualities, that's when you're referring to infinity. Infinity is the plethora of objects, of limitations, boundaries, parameters, you know, quantities and qualities. That is just the manifestation of the eternal. And of course, it's going to at some level reflect the eternal. And the way that it reflects the eternal is the fact that it does not stop. That's why we say it's regressive, it's regressive. Oh my God, why? Well, because it's reflecting the eternal. There is no stopping it because it is beyond anything relevant to stopping. Stopping is just something that's part of spatial temporal construct. It's not a relevant thing in the eternal.
Well, part of the reason that I initially contrasted the notion of an infinite regression with an infinite progression is the concept of infinity, of something going on forever. That's not the part that I have a disagreement with. The part that I have a disagreement with is infinite regression seems to insinuate we're an infinite distance from the absolute, which is right, descended from. Whereas my way of thinking about it is descended into. You're never any distance from the absolute. You're always deeper in the absolute. That's how I would think of it. That's why I think of it as progression as opposed to, because regression is an idea of we've in the what is it called? There's
Progression
a
implies
particular
the
way.
same thing. That which you're disagreeing with, progression by symmetry of identity implies the exact same problem.
No, it doesn't. Yeah,
Distance,
progress. Well, no, because it's
when you say
progress
you're,
itself.
you're invoking
It's the difference
your,
between emanationism and
yeah,
an internalizing concept, right?
sure, but it's
Emanationism is an
arbitrary because
abundance that pours outward.
when you say deeper and progress, this is still tied to spatial temporal things, right?
Well, yeah, there are no terms other than those. But the
yeah.
distinction that I'm trying to make is that emanationism conceptualizes a superabundant source and an overflowing that
Mhm.
moves outwards. That seems to me wrong because it implies that there's this distance, that the causal chain is this thing that separates us from the absolute. That
Yeah,
seems to me wrong. The causal
yeah.
chain just is the
But
absolute.
that's just, I think, because we're bound by the limitations of language. We don't have words really to, we have to
Yeah,
do it in the
well,
negative space, you know.
I agree, but
Yeah.
that's partly what I mean is for me, it's like trying to find the least confusing way. So it's like, it's not the infinitely going on thing that I have a problem with. It's the infinitely going backward. It's specifically the regressive notion that I think
Yeah.
inculcates a confusion. Whereas infinitely going on, I think that actually is harmonious with how I understand existence to work is
Yeah,
it's like somehow you have this.
I agree with that. I mean, if there's one that's misleading versus the other, you're right there. But to me, they're both misleading at the end of the day. One is more misleading, but they're both misleading because they invoke this notion of space and time, movement, distance, all these things. And when we're talking about the absolute, like it's just not relevant, right? I mean, these things are what are encompassed by the absolute, sure. And I think that regress isn't a problem,
Well, okay.
just like progress isn't a problem. I mean, this is just an effect that we have, like I said, because we
Well,
operate
yeah, I
that way.
wouldn't framing it as progress. I wouldn't conceptualize it as a problem.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to me something problematic about thinking of it as descending into itself infinitely. The idea of regressing infinitely seems to call out for a ground because it's like the idea of regressing already presupposes this notion of stopping somewhere, right? Regressing to, that's
Yeah.
implicit in the notion of regressing.
Yeah, but
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 I
progress
mean,
still implies time. That's what I'm trying to say.
it does still imply time, but
Yeah.
but thinking about it further though, like the descending into itself, to get deeper, you actually get into the realm of time. You actually get into the realm of like creatures like us. Like
Mhm.
that is deeper. So in a way, that progressing notion is more appropriate to me. Yeah, it
Absolutely.
doesn't
I
seem
agree. No, no,
confusing.
I absolutely agree. Like I said, I just think that, if we're trying to see that going deeper in relationship to where is it going deeper from, or how is it going deeper, or what is the ground of reality, it still is one step removed from language that we could be using or concepts that we could be discarding to arrive at that higher articulation. That's all I'm saying. So like, but you're absolutely right. Like it is very characteristic of what is happening. It's an infinite progression, absolutely. But that's what was cool about that grid that I had shown you a few weeks ago. The relationship between an expansive universe and a collapsing one.
Yeah.
I think that the two, of course, are also both, that there's a regression and a progression as well. But yeah, insofar as trying to understand the relationship between eternity and infinity, or at least understanding that the trilemma is actually a trifecta, that there's nothing wrong there, that they are features and they're only wrong from a certain perspective, then yeah, for that purpose, I would say we can use these terms regress and progress.
Yeah, there's a lot to chew on there. I'd love to like follow up on some of those threads once I've had a chance to. Because, for instance, the supposition about eternity and infinity reflecting one another, that for me, there's a poetic resonance to that I'd love to think more about before I,
Mhm.
try and give a clumsy.
Well, I hope I've explained that or expressed it clearly enough. It would be cool
Yeah,
to
yeah, no,
hear.
you have. It's just like for me, it's like I'd like to explore the implications. You know what I mean? Because that's usually what I find most interesting is and I think this is why I really like the kind of project that we're doing on the channel. You know what I mean? It's like even though, because you'd think from how I'm talking in this dialogos, for example, that what need would I have to be talking to people who've got other models? I think I've got it all figured out. You know what I mean? And like obviously, I do think that in a certain sort of way. But also, like, for me, it's super important to. There's part of what the open model approach has taught me is that other people's closed box systems give them access to parts of reality that aren't, like, immediately apparent in my closed box system way of relating. And those ways, like that, the other people's frameworks in that respect, other people's closed box systems can be super useful as a resource to draw conceptual techniques from in modeling some aspect of the open source phenomenology
Yeah,
that is reality, right?
but as an interjection, I don't have a closed box, right? I have a door to the open world that's very different. And
Sure.
also, like, just to reflect you a little bit, I think I have it figured out. And what I have figured out is that I don't have it figured out and that there is nothing to figure out. Like,
Yeah.
that's so it's not in contrast to you, it's in parallel to you in a way. That I think that what I've figured out is that there's an infinite amount of black boxes.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
partly what I was saying,
Yeah.
that's my feeling as well, is that there's as many closed circuit ways of relating to the world as there are types of organism, types of individual, perspectives. And, you know, it's not mine is a particularly impressive example, I think, of like what it looks like if you really strip it down and polish it and make it really robust and all of that. But for me, part of the reason that am so passionate about synchronicity is that, synchronicity time and time again brings me up against experiences that challenge the conventional assumptions I might make based on the black box. So it's like, more and more as I kind of branch out from my like hyper rational picture of reality, more and more what I discover is that, like, however accurate it might be, it is just a little box. And reality is nothing like a little box that I can fit inside my head. And so, the important part for me is like because you're talking about like a door, and for me synchronicity is that door. So in my study of synchronicity, what the techniques that I call stalking synchronicity, that is for me exactly how I enter into other people's boxes so that I can sit down and look around and be like, what can I see from here, and look, actually that phenomenon that brought me here is, wow, look at that, look how that looks from here. That's so crazy. That actually looks like it's clearer from here than from where I was sitting, and all sorts of extraordinary things that you could never find out sitting in your little box, looking out at the world and saying, this is what everything is like. And look, my squares map onto everything perfectly. It's.
Where does that leave us in so far as truth, though? I mean, like, is your black box the absolute truth, or just one of the possibilities of truth that can exist within a
Somehow,
larger truth?
somehow it's both, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Somehow it's both. I mean, when it comes to like giving a definition of truth, I don't refer primarily to DM theory because that's my private model, my private picture of what it's like. When I am asked about truth, I usually talk in more generic terms that everyone would understand. So the formula that I love the most is truth is that which is as it is, independently of anything we perceive about it, conceive about it, or say about it. No matter what we think or see or wonder, anything like that, reality just is a certain way. That's what truth is. Truth is just the way that things are. And so for me, it's like the thing in itself, the object of existence, nominal reality in a Kantian lens, right? All of those work for me. The ground, yeah. So those are like, I think, kind of like perspective
Yeah, but then the question is, what
invariant
is that?
terminology.
And then you can't answer it because you've said that this is the one thing you can't say. Mm,
Well, yeah,
uh,
that's the thing is I can say what it is to me, and I can kind of give someone else some tips about how they might work out what it is to them. But ultimately, one of the things that stalking synchronicity has taught me is to stress that if they have an interest in living a richer, more fulfilling, more transformative life, that they kind of be wary about any scheme that's going to exert a tremendous influence on how they construe their experiences,
yeah.
because that leads to a cutting off. As human beings, we are automatic creatures, and if we find a way of making sense of things that seems to work for everything, you better believe we will make good fucking use of that, and we won't stop, and we'll apply it to everything, and we won't notice the parts of the world that it filters out precisely because they've been filtered out.
Does that make you a relativist or both, like both, objectivist and subjectivist?
No, I mean, I think of myself as an integrative pluralist, I suppose.
It's like that's what I'm thinking, like, we have to go into, like, what does it mean that now we're trying to understand the relationship between each other, but the endeavor at first was to understand a relationship to truth. Is that one that is personal, or is it relational to other people, right? Like, are we trying to define truth between each other
Yeah, well,
or
that's what I
for
mean is
ourselves?
like when I say something like an integrative pluralist, I'm explaining myself to you, right? If I want to explain truth, I will stick to something generic like a formula, like that which is as it is, no matter what we think or say about it. Something like that. That to me is like, if I say that, you know what I mean. And we might sometimes people will disagree about whether there is such a thing as the way the world is. Usually not. And, that anchors the discussion, I find. But partly what I'm enshrining by making that assertion is I'm saying, whatever else we might think about this concept truth, I'm going to expect that when you use the term, you mean something like it answers to the way things are. Unless you mean that, I don't know what you mean. You know, that's partly what I'm stipulating right at the beginning when I have a discussion about something like truth is for me, truth always is about correspondence with the way things actually.
Yeah, well, can we actually grasp onto that actuality? If you say no, then does that mean we don't have access to truth?
So can we I mean, we have indirect access. So the kind of access that we have to the way the thing in itself involves mediation. Your nervous system is effectively a really large complex filter. It filters out most of the information and prioritizes and organizes a small subset of that information that you're particularly adapted for processing. We call these the senses: sight, sound, touch, etc. Yeah, so your brain synthesizes what you call reality from a selection of the data, say. Ah, so that's very indirect, very indirect. It also synthesizes the concept of the present moment.
Mhm.
There's good evidence of that.
So you have access to it, but as it filters down to you and how you can articulate it or manifest it or perceive it, it is no longer the entirety by extension of it
Correct.
being reduced anyway.
Correct.
So it's kind of both.
Correct. Yeah, and so it's like there is a way in which you can extract out of what you've got regularities that plausibly can be generalized beyond your synthesized experience to the way things really are. That's what science is about those regularities we can abstract out from our experiences. So there is a way in which you can do that, but and this is where I think it's really important. So this guy, Donald Hoffman, I don't agree with the way that he relates to his theory, but he has this theory called interface theory, very helpful for understanding what I'm talking about. And that's partly what I keep using. I use a figure of speech all the time, which is flattening down to fit it in your head. That's why I like the boxes analogy. Boxes can be flattened. And it is very much a flattening. You got to narrow reality down. But he kind of talks about how, he analogizes the perceptual interface as like a computer GUI, like on the desktop. So you double click and an app spins up, and the thing that you double click doesn't have a really substantial relationship with the thing that actually happens when you double click. It's just like a convenient shortcut. That's literally what it's called, a shortcut.
Mhm.
And he kind of says like all of reality is like that. I think that's misleading and he kind of talks about how what actually gets selected for isn't what's true, so to speak. It's what sort of is useful. What is useful for fitness, or which is true, but also like what's useful is intrinsically related to what's true. So it's a very confusing kind of a distinction to make. But he kind of talks about how because of this perceptual translation that's going on with the interface, reality could be radically different to what we think it is. Facts is not just could be, is radically different to what we think it is. This is the narrowing down thing that I'm talking about. Now, an interesting implication of that is imagine aliens on some other planet in some other solar system, somewhere else in the universe. And the conditions are rather different than the conditions for life here. And so the evolution of the organisms, the organisms evolved to map regularities that we are totally unaware of in nature. So you can think about how birds navigate. They have like a deposit of some mineral in the back of their eye that helps them to actually sense the magnetic sphere of the Earth, the magnetic field of the Earth. And they use that to navigate. Well, we would have no idea what would that sense even be like. No clue. Similarly to that, but more radical, right? You
Yeah.
can think of kind of creatures that develop sense organs that are just so different from ours. Okay, so then you can think of, imagine those creatures came to Earth. Very plausibly, their technology would just look like magic. It would be impossible to us. Like whatever regularities made it work might well appear like a violation of the laws as we understand them. Right. And for me, that's a really important kind of analogy to help open up what is meant when we're talking about this idea of narrowing and the richness of reality. Because the truth is, reality could be composed of 1,000 different wavelengths,
That's what I was thinking. That's why I don't necessarily think that, truth should be tied to the regularities that we can extrapolate with our science or
What else
empathy.
can we tie it to,
Well,
though?
well, what I'm saying is is there aren't that many regularities, so that leaves you wondering regularities within the possibility sphere of what? Irregularities? And that's what you have to look at. I mean, like, what are those irregularities if not true? I mean, you see what I mean? So, like, to me, yes, you're absolutely right. I think that you're extrapolating forwards in a progressive way, which is I think, very useful to people. But we can go backwards as well to give a new perspective on what you've just said. Give someone a laptop 400 years ago, and they would say, "This is magic. Like, this is not possible." But we understand the regularities that we've extrapolated with the laws of physics in order to be able to create this technology. And it's a very logical sequence that we can explain to people, and then it'll make sense. But until then, it's magic. But to me, the magic also lies between the regularities, right? The fact that there
Oh yeah.
is potentially entire spaces or fields or phenomena in which there is irregularity and yet it still is. And that is like next level paradigm stuff. And that's what I'm trying to say.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah. What I would say is, in my experience, irregularity is regularity of a higher order that you just can't wrap your mind around, you know?
exactly.
And so, like, there are aspects of, say, synchronistic phenomenology that appear, in a sense,
Mm,
to break. This is, we left off. There was a question about, does it transcend logic or does it break the limits of logic? And in a way, it does, because what you think logic is not what it is.
yeah.
Because the logic of nature is so radically rich compared to your flattened down idea that from your perspective, it does break those boundaries. And actually, that is what magic is. Magic is not just that in between space, but it's also part of what magic is. And this is what magic has been to human beings historically, is there are more regularities available to you than you are consciously aware of,
Mm,
significantly more. And there are ways of tapping into them and influencing them that involve more than just your conscious mind. That, in fact, your conscious mind is a bit of a hindrance because it thinks it knows everything and thinks it knows how everything works and wants to be involved, has his fingers in all the pies. And it's like some things which we don't well understand are better just being activated through instinctive means. That's what magic aims to do. Magic aims to activate the not well understood capacities of the human soul and to direct them towards certain ends. And to the degree that that attempt results in like some successful outcome, right? Some actual measurable, seemingly significant change, that's when we say, oh, that's magic, because how the fuck did you do that? And the person doesn't even need to themselves know,
yeah. You're tying truth to magic right now, bro. You're gonna have to watch out if the FBI or any other organizations listening, they might snatch you up.
They're
Because what
coming
you
for
said
me,
is
man.
very, very logical. It's very clear. I love that soundbite. It's true. I think it's true. I think it's a good practice, yeah, to encapsulate everything if I'm thinking out loud for myself. Like there's a lot that we unpacked, but what is important here? Like, what is the takeaway from everything we're discussing insofar as what is truth? How does it work? How do you arrive at truth? All these different things. It started out with this idea that it reduces to a unity, and to understand the relationship between unity and its parts is somehow linked to being able to define truth, but it's not necessarily something that is relevant to utility. If you want to be able to do something with truth, then perhaps we have to divorce ourselves from utility, in fact. And maybe we discovered that there's a higher utility that is available to us, which is what I think Matthew was just saying. So, truth, if it reduces to a unity, would be the number one. And I would like to challenge anybody who really thinks that truth doesn't reduce to a unity and why. And that I think would entail having to logically explain how there could be two separate realities that have no relationship to each other. I'd very rarely say that something is impossible. That to me is impossible. And I don't mean that falls under the category of, hey, the impossible is possible somehow, and that's just the way it is. No, no, this is just impossible. It's just outside the realm of any kind of possibility. All realities, no matter how far or near or different from each other as they can be, have a relationship to each other. There's always some larger encompassment of reality. But if someone could do it and be like, look, here it is. I'm laying it out. Truth or reality is not reducible to one thing. And it has no relationship to another type of reality. Then I would say like you had have something that is revolutionary on the biggest of scales that you could possibly have, because it has a lot of implications as to what truth is if it is not reducible to one thing. I think the entire reason that humanity doesn't disagree on that point is because it really is that way. Now, you could say that's kind of arrogant and that human beings have nowhere near any kind of capability to make the assumption that reality reduces to a unity. However, the idea that reality might not reduce to a unity is outside of human capability, outside of human conceptualization. So, at the very least, if we have come up with this consensus that reality reduces to one thing and that we have a relationship to each other in that way, then it has something to say about human existence. And that's really what's important. If there is a utility that we're after, it would be that is to to understand human consciousness in relationship with itself and relationship with its own existence. And insofar as any kind of philosophical endeavor is applied, that is a good reason to do this activity of trying to understand what truth is. I mean, other than that, it's either mental masturbation or it's in futility completely, and I would have no interest in that. What do you think?
I love it, man. I had a couple of maybe closing remarks, and we can see if you have any thoughts about it and then round out.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say, something that I loved about your masterclass lecture.
It in, you're like, massacre.
I love it, man. I love it. One of the things I loved about it is you emphasized that how and how we ask the questions and what questions we ask is really, it plays a substantial role in determining the kind of answers that we find. That to me, as well as tied up in what I was talking about in terms of like the different, because the interface thing, that's like a very extreme example just to illustrate what I'm talking about. But more generally, how people talk to themselves about their experiences, how they make sense of them, how they narrativize them. That's really what is definitive, ultimately, of what happens to them, whether they learn or not, how they relate to what their choices are, their talents are, their opportunities, the story they're telling about the kind of person that they are. That's in a big way what ends up being the actual substance that they build themselves out of. And, I thought would be cool to kind of end on a concept of truth that, has been growing on me more lately over the past like couple of years. Like the one that I gave earlier, that formula, that's one that I've been using for a decade or more, But yeah, I guess partly it's a little bit of a frame, right? And the frame is like, you could ask what is truth, and there's the idea that, well, it's a story. It's one of the stories that human beings tell. Everything that we say, every single thing that we say, happened or is the case or whatever. That's all part of this. We're collectively telling a story about what's going on to make it make sense to ourselves. I mean, what choice do we have? And then you could say, and I like this because it's very resilient in the face of this, right? You could say, well, no, like what truth means is that there really is some way that things are, right? That's the idea. Like you can't just say it's a story. It's not just a story. The whole idea is that it's not just a story. That's the idea. And it's like, yeah, I love that story. That is a fucking great story. That's one of my favorite ones. I really believe that story. Yeah, I really believe in this concept truth. I think there really is some way things are, but also it is just a story though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like self-defeating, but self-sustaining at the same time. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah.
I love it.
Love it, bro. Hey, thanks. I really appreciate it. This is a really cool,
Thanks for your time, man. I've really loved the talk today, and I'm looking forward to doing more of them with you. I feel like
mm,
there's a lot of magic here to share with the world.
absolutely. I mean, it's just great sometimes to attack a very general thing like truth, though, to kind of get back to a higher perspective and then just reconvene and say, I'm articulating these things better now. We understanding this, better and arriving at
Yeah,
clarity. So it's valuable for sure.
absolutely, definitely. That's one of the things I love about the collaborative, synchronistic work. Where you feel that resonance is. I've experienced probably 2 or 3 times actually. There's a qualities to certain moments where it's almost like a group epiphany. So one person is like the channel. It's like the person, someone comes up with something that crystallizes, like multiple people are talking, there's a collaborative spirit, but there's a moment where someone crystallizes it and it's like, wow, in that you just got higher than any one of us could have got alone. And we all get to have that. That's a gem that everyone gets, and it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that feeling. All
Definitely.
right, bro. So I'll see you for the next one.
Sounds good, man. Thanks for your time. Have a great day. And yeah, see everyone later.
See you later.